Coming up, this year the Supreme Court is expected to decide a flurry of cases that impact Indian country. Plus, we speak with a history-making Navajo lawmaker in Kansas, and an update on changes in Canada's child welfare system. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
Arizona PBS is proud to support Indian Country Today. For 6 decades, we've provided television programs and now digital content. But we go beyond that, sending outreach teams across Arizona, offering workshops in language and literacy, family engagement and community outreach, and supporting tribal communities with early learning and school readiness resources. Join us at azpbs.org.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Thank you for joining the ICT Newscast. As COVID-19 cases surge, the Biden administration is working to ramp up testing. Around the nation, many people are reporting long lines and hard-to-find rapid tests, all as Omicron cases are breaking records. The White House announced Wednesday that 5 million rapid tests and 5 million PCR tests will be made available to schools starting this month. In Oklahoma, the Chickasaw Nation is asking its citizens to book testing appointments in advance due to high demand. And in New Mexico, the Gallup Indian Medical Center is operating on a crisis standard of care. According to Source New Mexico, this means the hospital is prioritizing which patients to see based on who needs the most care. The major hospital serves many Navajo and Zuni Pueblo families. It has 99 beds, with 6 of those being ICU beds. Hospital officials say there are extended periods of time when the hospital can't find beds for patients, and they're also citing a shortage of nurses. New leadership is being announced at the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. Deborah Parker is taking over as the Chief Executive Officer following the departure of Christine Dindasy McCleave. Parker joined the organization last May and served as the Director of Policy and Advocacy. She was previously the Vice Chair of the Tulalip Tribes and also worked with residential school survivors in Canada. Samuel Torres was also named as the organization's Deputy Chief Executive Officer. He says the organization is working with the Interior Department on its federal Indian boarding school investigation. That report is due in April.
What we're expecting the report to reveal is a further call to action. I think this will be able to scratch the surface in a lot of ways. And allow us to be able to make more targeted decisions and be more effective with how we direct our approach going forward.
Torres says in the future, the Boarding School Healing Coalition hopes to also tackle schools operated by Christian groups. Well, there are more efforts to get high-speed internet on tribal lands. On Wednesday, the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs held a roundtable discussion between tribal leaders and U.S. senators to collect insight on the topic. Many tribal leaders said getting internet access in their rural communities is a challenge, including the chairman of the Ute Mountain Tribe located in Colorado.
As for rural areas, it's pretty hard to even get things going on the education side with the online learning. Right now, we've had to put in some hotspots where parents have to bring their students to a parking lot just to access internet. I live 2 miles outside the community. I have to come back into the community to even access internet. For me personally, I can't do work at home, so I have to come back into the tribal office to get some work done. So areas of concern is telehealth, education, access to just general stuff that are happening in the community, but we have no fiber that comes straight into the community of our reservation.
Other tribal leaders said better internet will help with emergency services. At the event, officials encouraged tribal nations to apply for free broadband grants, some consisting of up to $500,000. In Phoenix, Arizona, a new art space founded by Indigenous women is focused on building community. The Cahokia Social Tech Art Space was established by Navajo citizen Unique Yazi and Melody Lewis, who is Hopi, Tewa, and Mojave. They say they want their space to foster creative placekeeping for Native art and culture.
That when you start talking to a larger audience that understands the mechanisms of placemaking, they begin to see why they kind of understand why there is a need for placekeepers, people who have existed right long before and can tell the history of what was there before.
The Indigenous women behind Cahokia say they focus on fostering a sense of creativity among their art family.
Being surrounded by Unique and the other people that are part of our space, it really allows you to embrace that way of thinking. So in Cahokia Social and Tech and Art Space, we just literally want to be that platform where Indigenous people meet to create, innovate, and achieve whatever they want to achieve in their respective work.
And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Coming up, we speak with a Navajo lawmaker pushing for change in the Kansas state legislature. But first, more on Supreme Court decisions to watch for in 2022. In 2022, we will hear a flurry of decisions in the U.S. Supreme Court that will involve federal Indian law. In other circuit courts, there are also major decisions and cases to look for that involve Native people. Joining us today is Stacy Leeds, who is a professor of law at Arizona State University. She has taught at several law schools across the country and was the first woman to serve on the Cherokee Nation Supreme Court. Hi, Professor Leeds. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start at the top. We know for sure that the Supreme Court is going to hear two cases involving federal Indian law. What are those?
So the first one is Dinesby versus United States coming out of the 10th Circuit. And it asks the question whether a defendant who was tried first in a Courts of Indian Offenses or CFR court on Mountain Ute Reservation and then subsequently tried in federal court on some federal charges, whether that is considered double jeopardy in violation of the Constitution or not. And what's at issue there is just the definition of these courts of Indian offenses and whether they're tribal in nature or whether they're wholly functions of the federal government. So that'll be an interesting one to watch. The other case that has been granted is the Isleta del Sur Pueblo case out of Texas, a long-standing conflict of laws between the Pueblo and Texas as to who can control gaming regulations. The Isleta del Sur, unlike most tribes, has some provisions in their Restoration Act that speaks to gaming regulations. So the argument here is whether this tribe will be treated like the other tribes in Indian gaming decisions, or whether the state of Texas will have broader powers than most states typically would in this situation.
In Dinesby versus the United States, I'd love to hear more about what the implications are. It sounds like this is a real case of tribal sovereignty being respected. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, it's an interesting thing because today the majority of tribes will exercise their sovereignty through their own court systems, and they won't have a localized court of Indian offenses. Those courts were a throwback to the beginning of the reservation timeframe, where there were Bureau of Indian Affairs agents and police officers that created courts on on reservation to control conduct of Indian people. And so it's kind of an anomaly of cases because there's just not that many of these types of courts left because they're a throwback to those courts that were created in the late 1800s. But yes, there's some mixed questions here about whether the violation was of tribal law or federal law. And then, whether that second prosecution in the federal courts is essentially the federal government taking two bites at the apple. It's well recognized that where you have a tribe exercising their authority and then the federal government exercising their authority, that's not double jeopardy. It's two independent sovereigns exercising their laws and their authority. But this one's a little tricky because there's those mixed questions at that local CFR court on the reservation. And it really answers this question, what really are CFR courts? Are they tribal in nature? Are they federal? And so this is an interesting one, particularly for folks who aren't as familiar with courts of Indian offenses throughout Indian country.
I can imagine. And in the second case, Isleta Pueblo case, what are the implications of that?
So, it's an ongoing legal battle between Texas and Isleta del Sur. And there have been several court cases on sub-issues, but it seems that this case going up before the Supreme Court will probably put to rest the ongoing challenges. What's interesting about this case is that you have a tribe with a very specific piece of federal legislation that restored their sovereign powers after they were not recognized by the federal government for quite some time. And in that Restoration Act, it had some language that talked about not being able to game in situations where it would exceed what the state might allow. So it's a unique situation that is not applicable to many other tribes. But it always gives us some insight when the Supreme Court hears these cases about how they're going to interpret statutes that impact tribes. And particularly in this one, where you have a tribe who has had their recognition not present for a while, and then there's the political winds that acknowledge and reaffirm their sovereignty. What exactly does that mean, and where are the contours and limitations there? So it's one to watch.
So we know for sure that the Supreme Court is going to hear two cases, but there's a handful of other cases that they could hear. Tell us about those.
So the volume of cases pending before the Supreme Court is really high this time, 80 cases potentially that could be heard. But there's two cases in particular that are trending that number higher than it actually is. There are 4 cases that deal with the Brackeen decisions out of the Fifth Circuit. And that tees up the question of whether the Indian Child Welfare Act is unconstitutional. And then there are a flurry of cases out of Oklahoma dealing with the McGirt decision, which was decided about 18 months ago. In the McGirt cluster of cases, 35 different petitions are filed by Oklahoma asking that the court just overrule the McGirt decision. 7 cases are related to McGirt in that they ask the question, does McGirt also apply to non-Indians who commit crimes inside of Indian country? And then there are 8 other cases that deal with whether McGirt should be applied retroactively to defendants who were previously convicted. And a few of those were denied earlier this week. So everyone anticipates that that retroactivity question will be off the table. But the Indian Child Welfare Act and the criminal jurisdiction cases in Oklahoma loom large, and that constitutes the majority of the petitions before the court at this time.
Oh, Stacy Leeds, thank you so much.
Thank you.
When we come back, we learn about a major overhaul to Canada's child welfare system. An effort to overhaul the Canadian child welfare system will soon get underway thanks to a First Nations woman. Cindy Blackstock heads the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society and has led this effort since 2007. Earlier this month, the Canadian government announced it will pay $31.5 billion to fix the nation's child welfare system. It's been a long journey to get justice. Writer and producer Miles Morceau has been covering this topic, and he joins us now to give us more background. Hi, Miles.
Hello, Leah. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. So tell us about this agreement and how did we get here?
Well, it starts back in 2005 when there was a young First Nations boy by the name of Jordan River Anderson, and he was from the Norrie House Cree Nation, and he went to the hospital with a severe muscular disease that was debilitating and required a lot of treatment. And when he was cleared to go home, he required support from the provincial government, which provided health services. But First Nations are under the federal Indian Act, and therefore neither the province or the federal government would provide support for this child to go home and be with a family instead of being in the hospital. And Jordan River Anderson passed away in the hospital, never being able to go home to a family. And as a result, that brought that issue of the fact that First Nations children should get the same amount of support, whether it comes from the province or whether it comes from the federal government. They can't be denied services simply because they're First Nations. And so Jordan's principle was established by the federal government. This is how we're going to provide services for First Nations children, but they narrowed the definition of who could receive those services so narrow that very few people could access services. So in 2007, the First Nations Child Family Caring Society, along with the Assembly of First Nations representing over 600 First Nations in Canada, took the case of this discrimination to the Canadian Human Rights Commission. The Canadian Human Rights Commission referred it to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, and they agreed that, of course, this was discrimination against First Nations children. They have to receive the same amount of support as any Canadian.
And so, because of that decision, it sounds like now they're taking actions to rectify the situation. Well, I guess rectify in terms of a settlement.
And there are two things that are going on with the agreement. One, there's a settlement for the First Nations children, their parents, caregivers, which could include grandparents, all those individuals that did not receive the fair amount of support that should have got from the Canadian healthcare system. They'll be compensated up to $40,000 per person. So that is half of the agreement. The other half is to reform the system, make things work better, provide full care for First Nations children in Canada.
So tell us more about the work of Cindy Blackstock.
Now, Cindy Blackstock is the head of the First Nations Child Family and Caring Society, and she has led this fight for almost 15 years now, advocating on behalf of First Nations children, building the case that they could take to the Canadian Human Rights Commission and then to the tribunal and continue to fight this. So the Canadian government did a number of appeals to this decision, went to the Federal Court of Appeal, continued to try to fight this decision. And along the way, Cindy Blackstock with the Child and Family Caring Society, they led that fight on behalf of First Nations children, on behalf of First Nations people, to ensure that they continue to fight the government along the way, beat them in court to get us to this agreement.
Now, I understand that all of this discrimination has taken place and occurred among many First Nations children. What has been the reaction now that a settlement has been reached and that the Canadian government is saying we are going to reform the system? What is the reaction from First Nations communities?
Well, certainly there's hope out there that we can begin to turn this around. But Cindy Blackstock in her press conference following this, noted that these are just words on paper. We need to see the work. Until we see the changes happening, we can't settle for just an agreement in principle. There's a lot of work ahead. So certainly the federal government has made that commitment. They've put those those words and that offer on the table. And there's a process in place that will hopefully begin to end this kind of discrimination, improve child welfare for First Nations children and for their families and our communities.
Well, Miles, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for your time.
It has been 1 year since Christina Haswood was sworn into office to represent District 10 in the Kansas State Legislature. Elected at age 26, Representative Haswood became Kansas's youngest sitting legislator. Since she's been elected, she's advocated for change in Native communities, and she joins us now to reflect on her first year in office. Representative Haswood, thank you for joining the ICT Newscast.
That's bene. Fortunately, I'm not the youngest anymore. I'm amongst the youngest. So it's been such an amazing experience. It's been surreal, a lot of learning, but just always thankful and blessed to be in this position.
Well, I'm so excited to have you here because I know in your first year of office, you've really taken a lead in introducing bills and a number of legislation. So tell us about maybe what you're most proud of.
So I was able to hop on a bill, be a co-sponsor for HB 200H, which is the Native American Missing Murdered Indigenous Peoples Bill. And Representative Dr. Punkwe Victor's Kozad invited me on that bill, which, funny enough, before I was in office as a grad student, I got to see this bill, getting its press release, and just having Representative Victor's Kozad ask me to be a part of this bill as a legislator was a really full circle moment, but also a lot of my academic work in grad school and undergrad during MMIP really brought forth this full circle moment to get this bill passed. And I'm most proud of the testimony aspect where I got to ask my young Indigenous community leaders in the Lawrence, Douglas County, Kansas area, young Indigenous women that have worked in the research field with me here in Kansas to testify on how missing Indigenous peoples is an important issue.
And your district actually has a really large number of Native people in it. So tell us about District 10 for people who've never heard of it before.
Yeah, so I'm in the southeast of Lawrence, Kansas, and actually Haskell Nations University is in my district. My district, House District, there's 125 Kansas House districts, and mine is one of the highest percentage in urban Native American population due to Haskell being there. And also I'm part of that statistic as well. And it's a unique environment where not only does that population reflect in my statistics, but also in the city of Lawrence, where they're starting to now focus on Native American economics and business and trying to empower entrepreneurialism. And it's really great to just have that representation come forth.
Yeah. And I would be really curious to hear more about some of the concerns that your constituents go to you for, given that it's such a high rate of Native people who live there.
So it's a definitely different perspective. So we have the college student perspective, and then I also interact a lot with our high schoolers and our middle schoolers and our young people, all the way to our elders. And a lot of policies or concerns that they come to me for is definitely college tuition, trade school, work development. But also I think an important issue that impacts them, also impacts me personally as a young person, but also when we talk about having Lawrence, Kansas being another place for Indigenous folks to set roots and to grow, is housing, fair pay and wage, and access to healthcare as well, because we do have one IHS clinic, but we don't have an IHS hospital. But so there's also those types of gaps in our systems as well.
What's really interesting about Kansas is that there are a number of Native legislators and lawmakers, both at the federal level with Congresswoman Sharice Davids, but there's also a number of you in the Kansas state legislature. So I'd love to hear more about what it has been like to be able to collaborate with two other lawmakers who are also Native.
It's been amazing to be a part of the change, and it's amazing to see how the other Indigenous lawmakers across the country that before my time have laid this groundwork. for me to be here today. They broke a lot of glass ceilings across the country for my name and for my background to be, on the ticket. To have 3 of us in the state legislature, I think a lot of Indigenous policy has moved forward. So one of them is HB 2001, I believe, which is changing Columbus Day into Indigenous Peoples Day. Historically, that bill has been introduced into the Kansas State Legislature from multiple years, but somehow with us in the legislature last year, all 3 of us, it got a hearing. So a lot of this Indigenous policy is continuing moving closer and closer, but it also gives us a seat at the table, a voice on issues that historically have not had that Indigenous voice. So, each of us 3 have kind of our own niches and expertise in these fields. And I think we balance out perfectly, but there's also a lot more room for more Indigenous folks to come up to the Kansas legislature. I don't think there's been an Indigenous state Senate leader, an Indigenous Kansas governor. We can go up and down that ticket. So there's more room for anyone who wants to run.
I have one last question and we'll make it short. Are you going to be running for re-election?
Yes, I will be running for re-election, and I'm so excited to do that.
Well, thank you so much, Representative Haswood, for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Thank you for watching. For all the latest news and updates, visit us anytime at IndianCountryToday.com. I am Aaliyah Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.